Today, we are being joined by big faces, especially from America. We have with us special guest Mr. Mark Safarik. He's a retired supervisory special agent of the Behavioral Analysis Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation from America. With a 3-decade career in law enforcement, Mr. Safarik has worked with the FBI for over 23 years, where he spent over half the time as criminal profiler. Thank you so much, Mr. Safarik, for joining me on the telecast. And understanding from you, how did you get involved with Behavioral Sciences Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Well, initially I was in law enforcement as a police officer and a detective working violent crimes in California. And this was in the early 1980s. And at the time, during a homicide school, we had a couple of FBI profilers who came out to give us some, to talk about how they looked at complex violent crimes, specifically sexual assaults and homicides. And I was actually fascinated by this different way of looking at, violent crime from a behavioral perspective, integrating that with the physical evidence and forensic evidence and behavioral evidence in complex crimes. And at the time, I had a couple of homicide cases because I was working homicide as a detective that I thought would benefit from that type of analysis. So that's really what got me started working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. And after about a year, I decided that that was really the direction I wanted to take my career to become an FBI behavioral profiler. And so I applied to the FBI, and then it took me really about 10 years once I got into the FBI to then be promoted into the Behavioral Analysis Unit, which is where I stayed for the balance of almost 13 years for my career in the FBI, and then I retired and started my own forensic behavioral consulting business, doing really the same type of work that I did in the FBI.
You've also worked with Dr. Ann Bergs, and we have spoken to her as well. But we also wanted to understand from you that in your 3-decade career, what have you observed about the psychosis of sexual predators?
Well, I think initially when in the 1970s, when we really started, the behavioral unit started doing research looking at sexual predators who both killed and didn't kill their victims, there wasn't a lot of research that had been done at that time. There were several researchers, Nick Groth and others, who were doing some of this type of research, but there wasn't a lot of research for us to look at. So the FBI, the behavioral unit, started doing our own research, mostly looking at homicide offenders. But of course, many of those, serial offenders sexually assaulted their victims, because we were trying to understand, what is the dynamic of this interaction between the victims and the offenders? What types of offenders are we dealing with? Can we categorize them? Because they hadn't actually really been categorized at that time. So that research continued. And then as I think this phenomenon, that started with Silence of the Lambs and others, and it got the public very interested in this type of work, research started being done around the country and around the world, looking at both homicide, sexual predators, serial rape offenders, to understand both from an academic standpoint and psychological standpoint what drives these offenders, and then from the FBI's perspective, because really our job really is to help law enforcement solve these cases of unknown offender cases of sexual predation, either in murder or in serial sexual assault, or just simply in sexual assault. So our perspective was a bit different than the academic perspective, sort of like Ann Burgess, who I know is a very good friend of mine and whom I've published with before and taught for Ann. So her perspective is a little different than mine, and I think she shared that in her interview, looking from a behavioral perspective at the actual crimes and what is the behavioral dynamic, and then linking those aspects back to the offenders, and then of course doing research and publishing in those areas.
Did you also notice any behavioral patterns amongst men who then become rapists and murderers?
I think it's very broad. I think it's very difficult to categorize or sort of pigeonhole men in a particular box as a predator or as a killer. What we've learned both in studying individuals who don't murder but say sexually assault or rape, and I use sexual assault because there's various types of sexual assault beyond besides raping a woman. But I've done research looking at sexual offenders who rape and murder elderly women. So I've specialized in sort of that area of sexual assault. But those types of offenders are different. The ones that murder versus the ones that simply sexually assault. And then, understanding the type of rapist that you're dealing with or sexual predator really comes down to looking at the specific dynamics of each individual case, which I think in the interview with Dr. Burgess, the woman that interviewed her was making that, that same acknowledgement that you have to look at each case, but there are different types of rapists. There are different types of killers. They kill for different reasons. They sexually assault for different reasons. Sometimes it is in the context of power. Sometimes it's within the context of revenge or retaliation. Other times it's opportunistic. In other cases, it's, it's sort of that attempt to, they're inadequate individuals, so they're attempting to have this sort of pseudo relationship with the victim when they sexually assault. And you can determine these different types of offenders by looking at the behavior that they engaged in with their victims.
Now, can a psychiatric study to identify such patterns of behavior help improve conviction rates in such cases?
I think really from our perspective, certainly, I think any research that looks at predators, whether they're murdering or whether they're sexually assaulting and not killing, helps those individuals who have to analyze those individuals when they're arrested. It helps the court system to understand these types of offenders and which ones will recidivate more readily than others. So it can impact how they're sentenced, how it can impact the conviction. From our perspective, it helps for identification, looking at the dynamics within a crime to identify the type of offender that we're dealing with, type of rapist, type of sexual assaulter. I think all of those would basically lend themselves to understanding the predator and understanding how we approach them in trial and then in conviction. And in sentencing, not in conviction, but in sentencing. How do you sentence somebody like this? Are these people amenable to being, to getting psychological help in prison, or are they psychopathic, probably will not benefit from any kind of, help, psychological help or testing within prison, and should remain in custody probably for life?
Now, we at NewsX have also pitched for a sexual predator study in our country. Now, considering the breadth of knowledge in America already on this subject, how would you recommend the law enforcement agencies go about doing this study?
Well, I think it's a multidimensional problem. There's plenty of research looking at sexual assault and rape. I mean, there are lots of journals that have published many articles. I've, with colleagues of mine, have published on offenders who are 50 years or older that sexually assault and murder. We've published on juveniles who sexually assault. There is a lot of research that I think the Indian government can draw from, really critical European research, American research that has been done very well. But I think that the issue is, how do you integrate that information that we already know about sexual predators? How do you integrate that information into the government, into law enforcement? Because it has to be a cooperative effort. And in India, as I understand it, there's an older culture and then the newer culture. So, the moral values of the older culture clash with the newer culture. And law enforcement sometimes doesn't look at, sexual assault that perhaps the way they do in the United States. So it's not only the research, which I think there is lots of good research, plenty of excellent research, but how do you then take that research and train your law enforcement investigators, change the mindset of those individuals, change the mindset of the public, change the mindset of the judiciary system, who then tries those individuals and then sentences those individuals. Everybody has to be playing on the same field. And all of those various components, I think, have to come together and recognize the seriousness of this type of violent crime and give it its due.
How do you suggest India must incorporate the best practices from the system in place in the United States?
Law enforcement has to learn how to investigate these crimes and how to prosecute, and then the attorneys, the state prosecutors, have to learn how to prosecute them, and the judiciary has to look at the seriousness of these crimes and then sentence these individuals to appropriate, prison sentences. So you can't just have one component. You can't have the Indian government or the forensic medical institutes in India doing this research and doing good research on Indian men, although I suggest that the outcomes will be similar to what we find in Europe and in the United States in terms of the types of offenders we have. But then, how do you take that information and weave it into, a constructive, forward-thinking dynamic that involves law enforcement and prosecutors and the judicial component and the public's perception, changing the public's perception of, is this okay? Is this acceptable? I think it's a difficult job, but it's going to involve, I think, a culture shift from law enforcement and prosecutors and the judicial system, forensic investigators, your medical individuals. Like, for instance, in many hospitals in the United States, we have SART teams, sexual assault response teams. So we have nurses, registered nurses, who are trained specifically in dealing with women who have been sexually assaulted or raped. They know the tests to conduct, the physical tests to conduct, the photographs to take, the interview questions to ask. And so that's a really important component. If you can't gather the correct evidence when a woman comes in, that has alleged a sexual assault, if you don't have the correct people that understand how to ask the right questions, collect the right evidence, take the right photographs, then you can lose a case right there. So we have those kinds of teams, SANE nurses, sexual assault nurse examiners, sexual assault response teams, all of that integrated in the medical community, right? And then law enforcement investigators that get the training in how do you conduct these kinds of investigations so that you can then bring that case to a prosecutor who can then bring that case to court. So, all of these integrate together, and culturally, changing the mindset of the culture of a male, an old school sort of male dominated society. That's not true in sort of the newer sense of the younger people in India. But, can you change that mindset in an older culture? It's a very, I think, overwhelming task, but it involves everybody. Research is a part of it, I think, but I think there are many components that need to be, addressed.
Mark, also understanding from you, you've dealt with these cases on a first-hand basis, and while dealing with these criminals, you of course have witnessed the worst in humanity. What were the kind of mental and physical challenges that you had to suffer from while facing the extreme levels of brutality and degeneracy over the several years that you were partaking in these studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I get this question a lot when I present. I think it's an attitude. And I look at it in terms of objectivity. My goal is I'm not for one side or the other. I'm for the truth. And I have the training and ability and experience to look at these crimes. And I don't allow myself to become emotionally involved in the case. And this is the type of work that I find fascinating and extremely challenging, but I don't let my emotions get into the case. I'm looking at the dynamics of the case, these complex cases, and I understand the minutia of the various aspects of these cases. And I just have trained myself to be extremely objective, even when listening to law enforcement investigators who are presenting a case, right? Because the way they present it will be different because they'll have a bias about how they look at the case or how they investigated the case. Really, it's up to me to look at all of the information they have and then to make my assessment. But to stay emotionally neutral in this, and it's not hard for me because I've been doing it for so long. I think for some people that is very difficult. And those kinds of people would not make a very good, criminal profiler because they can't keep their emotions out of it. And you have to remain objective from the very beginning and not take anything as an assumption. You must support everything looking at the behavioral evidence, the physical evidence, the forensic evidence, and integrating those into a story that makes sense for the crime that you're looking at. Can I explain why all of this behavior is happening and what does it mean without becoming emotionally involved? And it's difficult sometimes because we look at very egregious material, videotapes made by offenders that never see the light of day in the public, but we get these kinds of things. And you're right, they're difficult, but if you stay objective about it and rely on your training and your education and your experience, that's the way I look at these cases. And for me personally, because by the time cases come to me as a criminal profiler, as an FBI profiler, agencies have already worked these cases for sometimes years. So it's almost like the last step. And so I'm there representing the victim in this case. And it's my job. If I can't stay objective, I can't help the victim or the victim's families. So it's really incumbent upon me, and I hold myself to the very high standard, to not become emotionally involved and to stay incredibly objective as I can be when I'm evaluating the information.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.